So this is the Padlet that we have put together for the annual goals piece. On the left-hand side, you'll find all of our presentations. So this is this current school year's presentation we put together. This is the previous. So there's lots very similar, but there's some details that are different as we develop some changes as we go through implementing these different presentations. There's some samples here and a guide. We'll talk a little bit about that today. With the time constraints we have, we'll probably do more things together as we get through it. But I want to make sure you see these pieces. The handouts are pretty helpful. This little checklist is something that I go through when I have an extremely short time to work with a group and talk to them about goals. We might focus just on the goal criteria checklist, which encapsulates a lot of what we're going to talk about in this short form. And then there's some other handouts that I'll reference as we start talking through some of the details of the presentation there and annual goals. Documents and videos. These are just a few videos that I put together a while back on just the mechanics of the IEP system, how to record annual goals, look at those pieces, how the progress monitoring wizard works, and then there's some video support videos there also, as well as documentation on indicator 13 and an SDI document, which is something I'll refer to as we get into the work here shortly. What we have here as far as websites and books, these are just resources that we've used for either support of our presentation, resources that hopefully you can find useful. Lots of things for teachers, supporting reading and behavior and all those different things there. We also have a couple books here, a few books that have more or less of what we used as the basis for the presentation. So between the websites and the books there, those are all the resources that I used to pull this together. So it took a little bit of time, and it's not something we did just in 1 year. This particular viewpoint presentation has been going for quite some time. So this is the latest iteration of this viewpoint or the goals themselves. So hopefully you get something from today, and we'll get through all this together. Now, as we're going through the process here, I'm going to open up the presentation here shortly. One thing I want to make clear is as we work through this together, that this is a kind of an enumeration of the process of developing annual goals. So we're going to we'll talk about writing annual goals and look at a few together, but I want to make sure that you're aware of what's coming, that we're going to spend some time setting the stage for goals, looking at the process together and understanding how we build toward an annual goal, how it's connected to what we do every day with a student, what we're developing in the IEP and the rest of those components. So that's something I think is often overlooked. And when I first started teaching, I think that was one of our staples, really. IEP and goal writing was kind of an event. It just happened once a year, and we rarely revised IEPs and use them as a baseline or as a guide for the whole year without much extra work there. So when I first started teaching, we rolled in with paper IEPs and had a few days to write them for our whole caseload, and then we had a week or 3 days of conferences for everybody all at once. So writing an IEP and developing goals was an event, and the rules around goal writing were different when I started. The only thing we had to do was make a measurable goal. Whether we actually showed progress or not, that was not really mentioned too often. And now we have more guidance as far as how to make a goal measurable and how to base it on the skills the students working on, so we can hopefully develop something that's going to be useful to us and especially that student. So with that, if you're new hopping in with us today, if you haven't already, I'd appreciate if you have a chance to introduce yourself in the chat. Just let us know who you are and where you're working from. And if any want to add anything more to that, we welcome that as well. I'll put the Padlet link back in the chat too. For those that are jumping in, I don't want you to lose that piece. And I'll share more contact information as we get toward the end of our time this morning. So there's our Padlet. Want to make sure that's available. There's also within our website here, I'm going to switch to our IEP Resource Center website. There is a, well, you can find it on the front page now. It's something that we've been working on quite a bit. And I know I've introduced, if you've been to trainings before, I try to introduce this. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not a question. For the professional growth points, our staff, just if you've logged in, if you're registered here yourself, then your email is with us already. So you'll get an email with a certificate following this when this training is completed. It might take a few days for that to roll through, but you should get that. So you'll have those pieces ready for you. But what I wanted to introduce and share, just and there's lots of information on our website, and I encourage you to check that out. But we do have these self-paced modules, which are you do have to create an account to get in. There's no cost involved, but when you log into it, you have, I'll show you here, all kinds of courses built into this learning management, or these self-paced modules. There's all kinds of modules. A lot of them are based around the IEP system, but as you scroll down the page, you're going to see a lot of the trainings that we provide on demand or in district or virtually are available here. Usually it's a recorded virtual session, so it's shorter, and you can check those out. You can actually get professional growth points through these as well. If you complete the course, really it's usually just a video and some resources. There's an evaluation that goes with it. If you complete those components, then you can get a certificate for that right there. So most of these are 90 minutes to 2 hours long. The videos are, and you can check those out. They're all here, including walkthrough on goals here that we recorded earlier too. So there's lots of pieces here. I just encourage you to check that out. That's actually one of the links in the resources that we saw on the Padlet. There's a website in here that's somewhere in there. It's in there. There it is. There's our Learning Center. So you can check that out, log in, and you can see all the courses that we saved for you there. So what I want to get started here, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and flip over to PowerPoint so we have that together for us. Let's see if we can do that. So hopefully you can see that okay. There I am in the corner, so this should be interesting. The first time I've done it this way. But as we're going through this, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer as we go, trying to collect those as we can. So we're going to be talking about writing skill-based annual goals. And like I mentioned, my background in this is as a special education teacher first. Started off teaching in the elementary schools and taught some computer education, and then also worked in the high school in special ed. So spent several years in the classroom, more than several, and then I've been working for the Resource Center for about 15 years as well. So hopefully that comes through as we're going through this today together, and we'll try to touch on all the bases as we go through. So again, I encourage your questions. There'll be some times where I'm going to ask you to respond in the chat together if we can, and then and we do have a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time, so I'll do my best to get through it for us today. So as we're looking at this, let's see, there we go. So as we're going through this, just ask you to stay as engaged as possible in its virtual setting, and we'll try to keep it as entertaining as possible, but get some good information. Hopefully get some things in here that are going to make you think about how you do and how you develop IEP goals yourself, and then show you some different options as we're working through this. I want to make sure that we can explain the goal writing as a process. We're talking about the components and ways to evaluate goals. Agenda is a little different today, but here's the link to the Padlet again and the QR code. So if you didn't get that earlier, if you didn't get it now, we can come back to it. So if you have questions there, I'll make sure we get you that information. I always start with beliefs whenever I do presentations, just to make sure that you know where I'm coming from. I'm not going to say that anyone particularly has to follow my viewpoints on the way things are done, um, but I do want to make sure you're aware of where we're coming from when we develop goals and IEPs that and presentations from our resource center's perspective, that you know that our part of our job is to remove or minimize barriers whenever possible. So that's one of the main things we try to work on, and we can work toward the same goals and standards. We might not reach them, we might not get them at the same time as peers do, but we can still continue to work on those things. And actually, if I have the time, if you guys have the opportunity, one of the links I have in our Padlet is to the Iris Center, and they did and at least in my opinion, an excellent module on inclusive practices for students with significant cognitive or intellectual disabilities, and how that can work for us in our classroom. So if you ever have wondered about that and how that can work for students, there's some excellent research. It's really a great module. Examples, documents for general education teachers, for parents, for special ed teachers. Does a nice job with that. And I think one thing we need to remember in all cases is variability is the rule, not the exception. Every student's different. Every student learns differently. So we have to consider that special education students are just a different part of the spectrum, not necessarily the exception for this process. So as we're moving on through there, we can talk a little more about this. If you get a chance to look her up, Shelley Moore is who I looked at, pulled this little slide from. It just talks about the evolution of inclusion from, exclusion, where we kind of began with this, to where we're more inclusive and now thinking about teaching toward diversity, getting students realizing that, like I said on the previous slide, variability is the rule, not the exception. Every kid comes from somewhere different, and we need to consider that as we're looking through and developing plans for them. So you'll see this slide pop up several times throughout this presentation, but it's a big deal and something that we need to keep in mind as we're working with students throughout our careers, is that, students are a product of their environment, and that environment at school includes everyone there, all the stakeholders, the school, the community, and the family are all part of this process, including the student there. So their input are important as we look around. So it may be unusual for us to look at the community input, I guess, with some of these things, but consider that's where the student's living. What do they need to learn to operate independently in that environment? Not just family and school, but especially when we get into transition age students, what's our target here? What's going to help them be more independent? So that's really the purpose of special education in general, really. So let's get to it here a little bit as we start looking at the process here. Where we're going to start today is looking at progress monitoring data. And I used to put this toward the end of the day, but by that time, people don't want to talk about progress monitoring. So, but I wanted to talk through, how collecting information influences the design of the goals and the rest of the IEP. So as you look at an IEP, the better the information we have, the better goals, the better IEP we can develop. So if we don't have good information, like for example, when a student moves in maybe from out of state and we don't have much information on them, we're going to really struggle to write a good IEP and develop quality goals and services for a student that we don't know much about. So it's important as we develop the IEP that we have good information to lean on, and not just good, NWEA scores or things like that, like the few times a year kind of thing, but good formative data that tells us how the student's doing right now, not just how they did 2 months ago, but how they're doing, so we can help inform the team and develop a good IEP for that student moving forward. So as you see, each one of these is connected to the next. So where we start in progress monitoring data, it'll lead us into present levels in that discussion. And really in terms of this process, if you think of Indiana IEP, we're looking at that annual goal page now. So the present levels here is really looking at that little sample. What section are we looking at? If it's a math goal, let's look at the math data that we have. Or it's behavior, let's look at that data first to help us inform the goal we're about to write. So we're looking at that cross section. Now in the existing data section, there's a space for the big review of present levels and data there. But we want to make sure in this case for goals, we're really focused on that specific piece. So we'll look at grade level standards a bit. We'll talk about accommodations, modifications, and then special design instruction will lead us right into standards aligned annual goals. So let's go ahead and dive in here. Hopefully that's okay. If there's any questions or concerns with where we're at today, please let me know. Like I said, I'll be looking at chat, looking at the QA there. If you have anything to share or questions, I'll be looking through that as well. So when we look at progress monitoring, one of the keys that we want to consider with this is frequency of measurement. So a lot of times as schools, we get a little bit, I don't know, it's not really confused, but we correlate data collection with data reporting. And usually we report data quarterly, which makes sense. That's when grades go out too. But we also want to consider more frequent data collection, because that's the more frequent we can collect information, the more accurate we can be with our progress, and we can more accurately evaluate how effective our specially designed instruction is, and all those pieces that go along with it. So I'm not here to tell you how often you must do things, but I will at least offer the advice that the more frequently we collect information, the more I guess agilely we can respond to student need. Because if we only collect information just a few times a year, then each one of those few times is how frequently we can respond technically to that need. So think about collecting information, what's reasonable and doable for you as you're developing this IEP. Because data does drive instruction and intervention. So we want to have good information about what's going on with the student and what we're doing with them. So how effective is our intervention and instruction? And that's going to be hopefully reflected in the data that we collect toward the annual goal progress. So when we collect information, it's important that we also review it. That's a big step that sometimes is missed. It's not just collecting the information and reporting it, but reviewing it. What does it tell us? Is the student making the progress we'd expect? If they're not, what's going on? If they are, fantastic. If they're making better progress than we expected, then let's lean into that. What else can we do there to help improve that student's progress even more? And I talked about this already, that this data that we collect, the progress monitoring information, I hesitate to say data sometimes because I don't want you to think that we just have to have graphs and charts for everything. It can be student information that's based on an interview or an observation, text, journal entries that the students are check in and check out, referrals or just journals that you keep in those instances can all be data that you refer to here. Like, hey, we have records of the student engaged in this activity three times over the last 9 weeks. Maybe we should do something about that. Those can be journal entries that we collect and good information, not just numbers and charts and graphs, but those interviews with classroom teachers, with students, with parents can all be valuable sources of information to help you develop an IEP. And that sometimes that'll happen when students move into us, or if they're coming to an early childhood situation where we don't have any hard data that we've collected. We have to talk to the parent, talk to the students, talk to all the stakeholders involved, and what do we know about this individual, so we can help design a program that's going to fit best for their needs. So some ideas here that I just wanted to throw out to you as a group here. When we talked about progress monitoring, this is something you can give us about 30 seconds or so to respond in the chat here. When you think about progress monitoring and formative assessment, what does it look like in your setting? And what tools do you use or have access to for data collection, or if any? So just real briefly, take a minute or like I said, 30 seconds And what does progress monitoring look like in your setting? And I'll read out a couple of them. If I'm just looking for a couple responses I can share. Just take a little time to dive in there. So I'll be looking at chat here for responses and see what we can come up with. Thanks, Brandy, for sharing. Daily behavior charts are perfect. That can be done by the classroom teacher, observations, an assistant. Data sheets, goals are listed. Classroom assessments, exit tickets. Perfect. And it looks like a lot of these are leaning on the classroom teacher for a lot of this information, because that's one of the big points to try to make, that we can't necessarily do it all. This is a team approach that we have to look at. So I like a lot of those. And key thing in these are those, that it's a formative assessment, that it's ongoing. It's not necessarily a summative thing, but looking at what's going on with the student. So lean on those things that's going on in the classroom. If they're doing little sample assessments or sample, we used to have writing prompts at the beginning of the school day for every student, and we could get a hold of those things and keep track of how the student's progress in writing. We could also look at, sometimes we do math samples just like that. Yep, looking at entrance and exit tickets, looking at those pieces. Just thinking in terms, sometimes it's hard to align those to goals if they're not talking about exactly the same things, but I think that's a big piece, leaning on what is already existent for us, so we don't have to necessarily create a special ed piece. Yeah, and all those different observation pieces, and keep in mind that this is a team that's in there. And I think I like this a lot here when we think about, sorry, I'm moving this around. Thanks for sharing those. First of all, I appreciate you guys diving in. I know it's sometimes hard to get into the virtual reality piece, but hopefully you can see the slide okay. But the idea here is, data collection works best when there is a plan. So what's your, think about that as you're developing an IEP, as you're there at your case conference, as you're talking with your other teachers of service, your assistants, other special ed teachers. What's the plan here? Can we do this? Because that's one of the big pieces we need to consider as you develop progress monitoring, a progress monitoring plan in terms of the annual goal, is who can be there and what's going to be done in that case. Because if we understand what we're supposed to do and what we're doing for this student, but we don't have anyone to do it, that's a big problem. So we have to think about that. And sometimes, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, one of the problems we run into is scope of the goal. Like if are we tracking progress on the student's behavior all across the school day? If so, who's keeping track of all that? If that's not possible for us, look at the goals we're writing and what do we specifically need to focus on there. Put a bracket around that goal a little bit. So when we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but what do we need to put in place so we're focused on this, so we know we can progress monitor there. So as we're moving through this, some data collection methods, there's a checklist, there's permanent products, curriculum-based measurements like correct words per minute sometimes, correct digits, and writing. There's different methods for writing as well. There's resources in that Padlet for Intervention Central, which has some great examples and some built-in professional development around these different tools. So that would be a place to look into. Interviews, like I mentioned, self-reporting can be an option for students, and then those observation pieces. And one of the handouts I have in the Padlet is a table around observation techniques. The big idea here for all of these, though, is we have to have a really good idea of what we're looking for, especially with behavior. If we're asking someone else to do that work, we have to really be clear in the goal. What exactly are we looking at? So we had the on task, off task charts evaluations that we were mentioned in the chat earlier. When we talk about on task, off task, or in seat, out of seat, those kind of things, of the observer has to have a really clear idea of exactly what we're looking for, or we can end up measuring completely different things. So here's a bunch of links. I mentioned the Irish Center earlier. Here's a few links that I try not to overwhelm folks with resources on these, because sometimes you get like 50 pages of because there's so much stuff out there. Here's some that are really good. If you get the chance, take the time. Irish Center especially, this one's on formative assessment, but they have all kinds of modules around special education. If some of you are pursuing your license now, you may have already visited a lot of these. So I apologize for adding to that, but it's a really good those are really good resources there. So if any questions before we bounce into present levels and existing data, I want to take a little time to check in with everybody there. If nothing else, if you have a question, please type that in the chat, and I'd be happy to review that go back and check in with you with that piece. When we get into present levels, the big thing I wanted to mention here, big things, is make sure they're current and relevant. And we don't need old information there if it's not relevant to the students right now. If we're talking in terms of the big present levels and existing data, this is the baseline for our whole IEP that we're trying to establish. If we're looking at the focus method on our goals, this is current and relevant to the goal we're about to write. It should have baseline information that express the needs we're trying to address in the goal. Talk about academic needs or functional needs, depending, and then reiterate how this affects the students' access to and progress in the curriculum. So we can have some big conversations around what that is, but there's really only one curriculum we have that we need to follow. Even if the student's pursuing a certificate of completion or looking at an alternate assessment, it's everything we're doing still based on the general education curriculum, which that statement alone might blow some people's minds, but that's something to consider. Actually, go to the module I mentioned from the Irish Center. They have some really good resources around that conversation that probably articulate a lot better than I could. I'm sure they are, but there's some good resources there for you. So I guess when we go through present levels of any level, whether it's the big on existing data or looking at the goal, we should have an idea, of what the student needs to learn and what needs to be taught that will improve their access and or progress in the curriculum. So I use the terms learn and taught specifically because there's some things that the SDI can be really what the student needs to learn. What do they need to learn? How are they going to teach? How are we going to get that? Excuse me, I think I had those flipped up. So the things it should be the other way around. The SDI is what we're going to teach the student. That how we're going to teach them, what method we're going to use, what tools we have available in the specially designed instruction. We'll talk about that later, of course. What the student's going to learn is really established in the annual goals we're going to write for that student. So the SDI is what they're going to get from us as a team, as a school, as a staff, and the goals are what's the evidence of the effectiveness. What are the evidence of how effective our specially designed instruction is? So the goals are based on all the SDI we're going to give them. Where are they going to land in a year from now? And that's what we need to be thinking about as we're developing these pieces. So I just want you to think about this one. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I want you to think about this a little bit. Thinking about development of present level, do you have guidance in your district for this? And think about how ways to improve that process. Because sometimes I think one of the barriers to good development of present levels is input from the whole stakeholder group. So think about the questions you ask and the prompts you give, because like when I first was doing this, we'd send out emails to our staff or documents or whatever it is for their input on the students' progress and how they're doing in their classroom. And generally what we get back is grades and scores and hey, they're doing fine or something like that. So if that's not acceptable to you, then think about the questions you do ask. You don't want to make it into a 20-page document, but think of a handful or maybe 2 or 3 questions that you could ask your general ed staff or teachers that work with the student, um, or your staff that works with the student throughout the school day, feedback from them on what challenges a student most, where do you see them be most successful, and those kind of things that you'd want to know. So think about getting information about the student's strengths so you can base the program you have on what you know the student's capable of, and to hopefully support them in their needs. So information on standards, information on working in large and small groups or independent study or whatever it happens to be that they're doing in the gen ed classroom that you can use to help develop a better IEP, because that's what we're trying to do here in the present levels piece, is get the information we need to help us write a better IEP for the student, and really not just on paper, but a plan based on the IEP. So when we implement the IEP, we have a good system in place to support this student throughout the school day based on their needs. So I'm going to try to talk briefly about aligning to grade level standards. We'll see how that goes. If you have questions here, we'll try to dive right in. As we look at grade level standards, one of the pieces that I try to focus on is the word alignment. So one thing that can sometimes be a sticky point for teachers or case conference coordinators as we're developing goals is that alignment to grade level standards, when we know the student is not currently functioning at grade level in a particular area. So what this alignment means is, first of all, that the standard doesn't have to be restated into the goal. So if the student's in 6th grade and the standard has to do with summarizing something the students read, which is one of the standards in there. The goal might be around developing the skills for reading or writing a summary if you need to. So maybe the student is trying to improve their comprehension skills, trying to identify or circle underline main ideas, or they're working on the writing pieces. So after they've read something, we want them to be able to write a short paragraph about that piece, or write out what the main idea was for that particular reading, whatever reading sample or whatever it happens to be. So we're working on those skills that the student needs. They will need to develop that 6th grade toward that 6th grade standard. So that's what I mean by alignment. So we might be working on well, I guess the way to think of it is the goals are really often written around the barriers the student has to learning. So we're going to work on those barriers that may not be at grade level skills, but they're barriers toward that grade level skill. So we're working at what you might find as a 4th grade reading level skill toward a student that's in 6th grade. Now it becomes a little more challenging if students are the more distant they are from grade level. But keep in mind, as you look at a standard, even if behavior is not written in there, or if mobility is not written in there, or vision's not written in there, or fine motor control is not written in there, those are such basic needs that they are embedded in almost every standard. So that's one conversation you can have with your team, like based on the student's needs, maybe their behavior is which standards are at risk. And that's how you can help align to those grade level standards that's going on, and keep them and really just thinking about what standards are the students going to be exposed to in the classroom, working with a gen ed teacher to do that, have that conversation, and then doing the best you can to identify the grade level standard as it's aligned to the goal that's being written. So just to kind of sum that up a little bit, again, we do have to choose the grade level standard, and we have 3 places we can choose, or 3 sets of standards we have to choose from. There's foundations, which is really only for early childhood. There's alternative standards, which are the content connectors, and there's the Indiana academic standards, which are our state standards for all those curriculum areas. So for most students, a vast majority, actually for school age students, about 98 to 99% of those students will choose from the Indiana academic standards. So we're aligning to grade level. And again, we choose the grade level standard, thinking about how we align the work we're doing in the goal toward that piece. The student has to work on this skill. They have to uh, learn this information before they can advance toward that grade level standard. So that's really what we're looking for. The student's not at grade level, then what are they working on to move them toward that? And that may not be we're not going to get there this year thing, but right now, what progress do they have to make? So I don't know if that helps some, but I think that's sometimes a sticky point there. So the bottom line is with grade level standards that you do the best you can. You want the work to be aligned to what's going on in the grade levels classroom. But I don't think anyone's going to come around and say, hey, you've picked the wrong standard here. You do the best you can. It's going to be better and closer aligned if we have those conversations with our gen ed teachers as well, because there's a lot of standards in there. So keep that in mind, to have them as a resource. Finally, on this slide, I do like to talk about the picture you see up here. This is really to talk about, to me, it illustrates special education in general. That, we're working toward the same outcome, but we have supports all around. And this is not necessarily a special ed analogy, but something we talk about when you talk about multi-tiered systems of support, that kind of thing, or multi-tiered system of support in your schools, that we have the stairs that are available to everybody. We also have the ramp that's there when you need it. And what I like about this illustration is you can access the ramp when you need it, and move back onto the stairs. There's also railings on the side if you need that kind of support. So, and you can stay on the ramp as long as you need to, and stay on the stairs the whole time if that's where your skills lead you as well. So I like this as an analogy, not just for access to special education, but if you think about tiered systems of support, it's the same idea, that where the support's where you need it when you need it, not you don't have to have any special qualifications to get there. It's there for us. So that's kind of my analogy there for access to the services when needed. So this slide reminds me to mention the idea. I don't know. Those high expectations are key. Yeah, we'll talk about this when we get into special design and instruction, but that presumed competence is a big consideration for students. So, where do you expect your students to land? When you think about an individual, for a second, take a second to picture an individual student in your current experience, and think about how your expectations for them influence where their outcome is. If we've already determined that this is the best we can do for the student, then we might need to rethink that. Think about, and even if we don't get to those high expectations, often we've made more progress than we knew we could. We want to set those high ambitious targets for our students and for ourselves with that student, and let's see how far we can go with them. Is it enough to keep doing the same things we've been doing, or can we challenge ourselves and that student, when possible, to reach a little further each time and make that progress and see how far we can get? So that, I don't know, that's I guess it's a fallback on that, shoot for the moon and you'll still fall in the stars, that kind of thing. But I guess stars are further though, so that analogy always bothered me a little bit. You kind of shoot for the stars and you might land on the moon, I guess would be where I would think. And that's kind of why I picked this little picture. But in any case, the idea is those ambitious targets, even if they're not reached, will often get us further than we've expected to with the students. So just keep that in mind as we're setting up for our students. So ideas here, when look at grade level standards, look for commonalities across curricular areas. One reason to do this is to make sure that it's clear that the students' needs exist beyond English language arts and math, so that the reading supports we need in English, we're also going to need in social studies and science. The math supports we need in our math class, we might still need in biology and the science courses as well. So just keep that conversation going, so we have those things available to students when they need them, not just in those core, ELA and math, but across the school day. And it needs, and we need to have conversations with our gen ed staff and other classroom teachers to make sure that exists for them. And I've mentioned this already, but relationships with our general education teachers are key. We need to cultivate those pieces and think about how they're going to contribute to the student's education, because most of our students spend, 80% or more of their day in that classroom. They spend more time in that gen ed classroom, much more time there, 4 times as much time than with us in a special education environment alone. And so let's think about how we can maximize that and work together for the best outcome for our students. So thinking about how we use our assistants, how we develop those relationships with the classroom teachers and with our students in those classrooms. Because the reality for me was going from an elementary setting into a high school setting is losing that day-to-day connection with students. That the kids in the elementary settings, I would see them, work with them in one way, shape, or form every single day. And that was not always possible in the high school setting, where someone else is doing the resource, so they need to have knowledge of the goals that students are working on so they can help them. While I'm the teacher of record working somewhere else. So, that was always a challenge to figure out how to do those kind of things, and making sure we had good communication within our special ed staff, much less the broader school setting. So that goes back to that shared responsibility piece, thinking about who's going to be there when this behavior needs to be observed, or who's going to help this student when their behavior starts to escalate, or when they need support in their math assignment, or hey, I don't know what to do here. Who's going to help that student out to guide them toward their accommodations, modifications, or just classroom supports, so we can get them in place? And who's going to teach those skills? Who's going to be in the right time and place to do that? And what do they need from me to do that, or if I'm not doing it myself? So those are big pieces. So that brings us into accommodations and modifications. So it's actually a pretty good segue into this piece. As we start looking at pieces, so I like this analogy from Leanne Jung here, that she said this at a training that I went to, and it's in a couple of her books as well. Think about this way, accommodations are support for a skill different than what we are assessing. So the bottom line with accommodations, any kind of accommodation, is think about what's being assessed. What are we looking for? Whether it's homework or a test and a quiz, or a writing assignment, whatever it happens to be, what's actually being assessed in this particular instance. So what accommodations can I put in place so the student, we can minimize the effects of their eligibility, and while we can't probably mitigate that entirely, we can sometimes help the student to minimize the effects of their disability, and so they can access this content. That's really what this is about. So we're still trying, in this case with accommodations, we're still trying to assess the same skills. The student is still accountable for that same information, but we might need to put some scaffolds in place so they can even get there. So we talk about a student with vision issues like this student here. For reading, the last thing we want to do is take their glasses away. So while it's not, we're not going to give everybody glasses just in case you need them, but this specific student needs them in order to read this document, to participate in class, to see what's going on in the classroom and the board. So we give them this particular piece. So think about things that way, that this student needs those glasses to access this material. If I took them away, they could not. Like right now, I'm wearing contact lenses. If I took them out right now, I would not be able to read and see what's on the screen. That my vision is that poor. So that's something to really think about. Think about the accommodations you put in place on a daily basis for a student. That's the level that they need to be. Without this accommodation, this student would not be able to perform this activity. Without those supports, without that prompting or the graphic organizer or the communication board, or the visual schedule, or the text reminders they have, or whatever the accommodation is that's in the setting, even if it's small group and preferential seating, they wouldn't be able to perform uh, without them. And I guess the analogy I often use is, think about when kids are small and they're learning to swim, we put those little water wings or life vests on them, and that's kind of what accommodations are. They're kind of a little lifesaver or life vest for these students in the classroom to keep them afloat, so they can even access the content in the classroom. So they need it. They have to have it in order to get there. Sometimes with high school students or older students, or there's obviously all kinds of scenarios here. We run into situations where students really prefer not to use those accommodations, and we need to encourage them whenever possible to use them, because we know that they need them to do better, to access this information. But we can't force them to. We have to have those conversations, and if they struggle with those pieces, to me, it's a clue for us to look at our environment. Why does this student feel out of place if they access these pieces? Why is it okay? Is it not okay for other students to access the same things? And there's resources, I think, a link for the CAST site. That's a kind of an authority on the universal design for learning process, but that's something to think about with accommodations also, that there's, things like a listening station are nice for everyone in the classroom to have access to. Wouldn't that be nice if I just wanted to listen to some voiceover as I'm reading something? That'd be fantastic for me. It'd just be nice for me to be able to hear that and maybe give me better access to that content. While other students might need that, it's nice for other students. So it also, when you have that kind of thing available, it lessens the focus students will get. If, oh, he's got to go listen to that, he's the only person in our room that gets that support. Well, what if we just give it open that up to others so they can get it when they want it, whilst this student can also get it when they need it. So I don't know, those are just several ideas that come up for me with accommodations. So I know sometimes it can be a challenge to make sure those things are available in the classroom, but those are big conversations to have. And you get to talk about what's fair and what's not fair for students. We're looking at equity, giving students equal access to content, not just equality, but equal access. So you think about, like, this young lady with the glasses here. Are we ever going to say something like, well, not everyone can wear glasses in here, so no one can? Or, well, everybody has to wear glasses now since this person does. We're never going to say anything like that. So think about that in terms of other accommodations. Like, of course, we're not going to give that accommodation to everyone. Everyone doesn't need it, but this student does need it. And it's an invisible, that's one of the things they sometimes call, with specific learning disabilities, it's like an invisible disability, because there's no outward signs that say, hey, I have a reading disability. But it becomes really evident when we start asking the student to read. So we give them structure, supports, so they can get access to the content, so we can move on. So we'll also mention modifications here. So modifications are, in this case, to stay with the analogy, their support for the skill we are actually assessing. So in this case, the outcomes, like if we're doing an eye exam, we want to know what your actual what's going on with your eyes specifically. So of course you can't use your glasses to do that. We want to see exactly what your vision is, so then we can plan on how we're going to support you from there. So sometimes we do that. That's a lot of times the psychological testing we did, educational evaluations we provide, do some of this to see, okay, let's check their reading, let's check their writing, let's check their behavior, and screen those pieces to see exactly where we are. And then we can start talking about how we're going to support the students in those needs. Modifications in the classroom change the outcome, the target for that piece. So if we're doing a math assignment and I don't have to do the whole, well, that's actually one of those areas that can be a little bit controversial sometimes, but sometimes like I see this for spelling and math assignments that I just want you to do the first few of these, the first 5 spelling words, the first 5 math problems, or just a portion of this piece. And that's technically a modification because we're not exposing the students to all of those areas that are being addressed in the whether so for the math, for the spelling test, for example, usually there's 2 or 3 different spelling combinations or rules that are being addressed in that particular test. So if we just have them do the first part, they're only being exposed or assessed on that first skill. Same thing with math. Sometimes we'll have them do the first portion, but then they're only really being assessed on the first portion ever. They're not getting to those other skills. So typically modifications, you could have the same instruction for students even, but they might be doing something different. They may be working on a baseline skill or developing a different skill and not being required to perform the same tasks that their peers are. So their outcomes are different in that classroom. But keep in mind that modifying work does not bar a student from being in that classroom with their peers. So up to and including modification, you can look through Article 7 and our federal law too. Bench is the same thing, that the students could be involved and should be included whenever possible with their non-disabled peers. So it's important that we don't consider modifications as a bar keeping students away from interacting with their peers. So, there could be some different things going on. If the student's working on as multi-step directions, for example, they could be working on a biology experiment and their job is to do a part of that with they're maybe not going to be doing the writing up the report, but maybe they're going to follow the steps in setting up the experiment or setting up the process or designing different pieces of that. And we can look at it, we can parse it out a little bit so the student's involved in the process, but not responsible for the whole thing. So that's modification pieces. And that has some pretty significant impacts as we go forward with students in the high school and so on. If they're modifying everything for the student, then it might change the diploma track. I don't like using tracking there, but the diploma that they're pursuing may be different than their peers. So we have to think about that. How can we support the student even up to the level of modifying their expectations in the classroom? That's a real challenge there. But so I don't know if that covers it for everybody there, but any questions as we talk about modifying and accommodating students in the classroom? Questions, concerns? Give us a couple. Just looking in the chat for anything there. Nothing new since we talked about the formative assessments there. But I did want to mention the accommodations and modification types here. So accommodations, and a lot of these are going to look like universal design for learning, how things are presented, the responses allowed, the setting, timing, and scheduling, organization. I know there's other things there. Modifications actually will address the curriculum and the assignments. So it's like look at the students receiving something different or asked to do something different than their peers. So that can be a big piece to consider. So as far as how does that work gradebook wise for the gen ed teacher, that's really discussion as far as the modifications, I assume, that you're asking about. I think you'd work together. You're still going to grade that work. We used to have to send some documentation home so that parents would know that the students' assignments were modified. But that should be pretty clear as we work through that, especially for conversations around case conferences and that's going to be part of the discussion we have at the case conference, that the students' work is going to be modified and we graded on the work they do, but they're not, they're going to be still responsible. In that case, they'd be responsible to the alternative standards possibly. So, but that'd be something to work out there. Just make sure, because if it matters to to everybody. Yeah, you could, I mean, percentages still be there. I think, I don't know, we get focused on grading an awful lot, and that's, oh gosh, I was just reading through good present. I'm trying to think. I just lost the name. And if I think of it, I'll bring it up later. But I just was looking at a free professional development opportunity that was talking about alternative grading solutions that, that, I don't know, this isn't the time or place, but there's a lot of conversations going on right now around grading, how we should do it, and how effective is it really? What does a letter grade even tell us about a student? So we have to think about that as we put a lot of weight on the grades that we have. So I don't know. There's different ways to do that, and possibly just having some good conversations, or when we send out those, uh, sorry, I was going to say IEPs. If we send out those report cards, there's places for notes, there's places for information, so we can make note of what's going on with the student. It should be really, really clear and no surprise to the parent of what's going on. But if we need to make it clearer, or to reinforce that, then maybe that's a way to do it. So let's talk about specially designed instruction and see where that leads us here. Specially designed instruction, let's take a moment and think about how you might define specially designed instruction. So if anybody wants to put something in chat here and add their two cents in as we're looking through this. So think about how you currently define specially designed instruction. Then we'll see if that comes up with what we're going to talk about here. Oops. So if you had to tell somebody who didn't know, or a parent, what does specially designed instruction mean? They're looking at the IEP, it's written there. What are we going to tell them? Don't everybody jump in all at once. Good. I appreciate that. Yeah. So specific instructional techniques used for, I like that one. What does a student need to be able to do? That can be effective too. Specific strategies that are geared toward a child's needs. Like, yeah. So I think we're on the right pathway for this one, definitely, as we look at it. And really, I try to make this in simplest terms as I can think of, is this is really what we're planning to do as a team in response to student needs. In present levels, we've hopefully lined out where the student's at. We know where their barriers to learning are. Here's where they are right now. Here's what their learning skills are. And this is what's keeping them from performing. Yeah, I think those are all really good thoughts as we're looking at these pieces. And it's really based on what the student needs, what are the adults going to do about it? What are we planning to do for this student's need in reading? Well, we're going to do some specific instruction like this. We're going to look at, so we can talk about those things. I think you guys did a really nice job. Those are some really good ideas that you captured there. Dominique, Jennifer, Brandy, Christina, thanks for sharing as we're looking at those pieces. And I think you can build off those, but I think that's something you need to be really clear in your minds of what it is. This is, like I said, this is the teaching part of things. This is how we're going to get to what the student needs to be taught and who it comes from. So I don't really care for this slide too much with what specially designed instruction is not. So I'd rather focus on what it is. So specially designed instruction is not intended to replace core instruction. It's intended to supplement it. And that's really sometimes difficult, because I feel like special education is so important to our students. Obviously, it's where we've decided to spend our careers, but this is, it's a supplemental activity. There's core instruction that is general education, and special education is supplemental. You can't really separate specially designed instruction and special education. SDI is a core component there for us. So we're supplementary. The core instruction happens, then what happens? What else does a student get? We're adding to that instruction because they need more support in order to make progress or have better access to that content. But we are trying to promote that independence. So that's a big piece too. That's one of those big pieces I think sometimes we lose sight of, that the whole point here is for the student to become more independent. And I've had that discussion sometimes when we'll have those, whether a student needs a full-time assistant or they need more accommodation in the classroom. At some point, we've got to figure out ways to help the student to be more independent, teach them the skills they need to organize themselves, to initiate tasks or to complete tasks for us, or even to interact with their peers. So how do we do this? Presume the student is competent. So we teach toward that. You know, we're focusing on the strengths of the student and trying to build toward those grade level expectations. That's where our eyes are always on. And I always think about this too, that a lot of times we think about grade level expectations. We think about just the academic standards, which is where our big focus is a lot of times, and rightly so. But also, you know, Indiana, we don't have our social skills standards a lot of times, those SEL, social emotional learning standards, which don't exist in our state, but there's a lot of chatter or discussion about them. You know, what should a 8th grader be able to do? What should that look like? What should their behaviors look like as well? So, you know, think about it in that term. A 6th grade student, what are they expected to do in that classroom? How are they expected to work? Are they expected to behave and interact with their peers? That's kind of what this is too. And that's aligned to the grade level standards right now, because we don't have any other really standards like SEL ones to work with. But we do need to think about that. Do they have those, I guess, adaptive behaviors needed to interact with their peers? And ultimately, this should respond to the student's unique needs. And I put that there so that there's a tendency, you know, especially when we have a big caseload, to get repetitive in some of these pieces, because, you know, all my students get this. Like, well, if they all get it, then that's curriculum. What we need to think about is, what does this student specifically need? And so that's what we can build off of there for us. So if every student gets this, then I hesitate to think where that's individualized. So we have to think about what's special for this individual. What do they get that they really need? So that I don't know, that can sometimes bring up a lot of conversations there as well. So what follows here, and this is really from, I mentioned it within the Padlet, there's an SDI spread the word document there. And this is where I got a lot of these pieces from. So if you're looking for specific examples for different pieces for SDI, here's some ideas. So teaching different strategies, modeling behavior, or in this case, academic behaviors, looking at communication. There's all physical, behavioral, vocational. So I just want to spend a little time here checking in with everyone in the room, or virtual room, I guess. You know, what would help you to deliver effective specially designed instruction? You know, thinking about that a little bit, when you've been successful with this, what has worked? You know, and think about how the students' outcomes are different if we're all on the same page with specially designed instruction. So take a second just to think about this, and if you feel motivated to, or feel led to, drop it in the chat for us, and we'll talk about it a little bit here. But what would help you the most to deliver effective specially designed instruction? And if, you know, what would help or what has helped, I guess we should open it up that way. So one of the things that we talk about sometimes with this, again, is this shared responsibility idea, that one of the questions, and it's addressed in that SDI spread the word document mentioned, who can deliver special design instruction? Yeah, I think obviously a special education teacher can do that, and primarily that's going to be what you do. But in partners, and really keep this in mind, in partnership with a gen ed teacher can also work. So that's, we're going to work together to develop this. So I think modeling is a big idea, and teaching, that way. Like, let me show you how to do this. Watch what I do. Let's do it together. And that's that explicit instruction technique that we often use. That watch what I do, and sometimes it takes several watch what I do's to get there. And let's do it together, and several of those, and then let's see if you can do it by yourself with my supervision and so on. So yeah, over and over again, that repetition is key on those pieces too. So that explicit instruction has got a really high value for our students, just being very clear in expectations for us as we're looking at it. So I appreciate that. Yeah, even if it's, because I think the thing sometimes that on-task behavior we worry about a lot of times, kids get out of seat, they're not on task, they're disruptive sometimes. Don't forget that explicit instruction is useful in those areas also, that we need to model it, show it, because obviously they're not getting it by watching other people do this. We need to explicitly instruct students in the behavior, whether it's academic or behavioral, or social, I guess is a better way to put that. So that brings us to the measurable goals piece here. So as we're looking at writing measurable goals, and I want to, I don't know, maybe justify a little bit myself going through where we've been. The idea of going through these steps of the process that we see here is to lead us into annual goals. So let's think about progress monitoring. Where do we know this? Where is the student right now? What do we know about them? Or how are we connected to the grade level? What accommodations and modifications are we already discussing that the student needs in order to access or make progress in the curriculum? What special design instruction do we think would be effective? So as we've gone through all those pieces, when we get to annual goals, hopefully what we're talking about at this point is based on what we have pulled together so far. Where's the student need to be by the end of this IEP? What skills we've already had conversation around what the learning barriers are for this individual, and then what teaching needs to take place in light of those barriers or needs. And then the goal is, what then is a student going to, or what evidence of our work is going to happen for this student in terms of the student's activity or behavior or learning. So that's the annual goal. Hopefully what happens is as we go through the process, the goal's right there waiting for us. So what I'll reinforce at this point is, if you're working with a student and you struggle to write a goal for them, look back a little bit. What do you know about them? What do you do with them every single day? What are we working on in the classroom when I have them? Think about those things that you do every day, elementary, middle school, and high school. When you see the student every day, if you do see them, or every week, or however often it is, are there things you make sure you mention to them? Are you things you make sure you say to them or work with them on every single time? Like I used to have a student, I'd look for him every single day, and we remind him on how to start the day, or we'd check in with him every day on how he's doing each time, and he would explain how his morning has gone for him that time. Or so we have those kind of check-in moments with each other, and that's something we did each time. You can write a goal around those pieces. Like every day, someone from our staff is going to remind this student on proper behavior in the hallways, or whatever it is. And ideally, they'll eventually be able to do it without our prompting. But we're going to do, those kind of things happen all the time. We don't necessarily, and I guess that's one of the things I always mention when I talk about one of the things that, the over and over routine that Brandy brought it up, repetition is key in some things, but just keeping in mind the things that you guys do all the time that aren't in IEPs. There's a lot of teaching that we do, of course. We do a lot of things. The annual goal we're writing might be the result of a year's worth of work to get there. There's all these things the students learn to get to this annual goal that we've had to teach them and they've had to learn from us. But also think about those things that you do that aren't written down. The things you do for students every day, that the little things that you mention to them, and sometimes we overlook how important those things are and the value they have, just writing them into the IEP so that they're carried forward to the next place. Because sometimes we can't do them at the next level, but you can mention the present levels and pieces like that. Here's what we do for the student every day that they get from me. And here's how, and this is how, what we did in support of the student's outcome. This is how we got to where we did. So it's clear to the next person, well, okay, I need to do something like that if I expect that outcome for this student. So making sure that it's clear what we're doing for all of our kids and realize all the work we put in for them and with them for them to reach the outcomes that they do. And make sure it's communicated so when they move on to a new school, whether they're traveling to another district and staying in the same grade, or they're being advanced into another building. So those next level teachers understand, here's all the stuff we do for them to get these outcomes. Now, you may not be able to do this exactly, but just know that that's what we did to get this. So if you expect this outcome, you're going to have to do something similar to get there. So I don't know, that was kind of a little bit of a soapbox preach there, but that's something to consider as you're moving students from one space to another. So let's dive in a little bit more into the goals. With the rest of our time, we're going to be focusing on the goal pieces here, and we're going to look through some different components here to start. So one of the pieces that a lot of folks struggle with is, how do we make a goal measurable? So as we go into our federal and state laws, if you look into those pieces, they basically mention that we have to make goals measurable and measure progress regularly. There are also some other rules for students of transition age, for early childhood, as far as alignment to post-secondary goals for transition, and alternative assessments having goals that include objectives or benchmarks, I guess. Early childhood has a different, that can be similarly addressed that with I should say is similar in that respect, but not always. So there's not a lot of guidance on how to make a goal measurable, though. So we took a little bit of this, and Dr. Michiel is who first introduced me and our team to this process. It's kind of a predecessor to the SMART goals that you might be familiar with. One of the things that I always mention, SMART goals always have that time component, which makes sense, but it's a business model. This is educational models and special education models, but particularly are around an annual cycle. So adding that time component is not always necessary. If your district insists that it's part of your goal, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's not necessary here. We're talking annual goal, and if we're using the Indiana IEP, that's built in the goals when we develop them. It has a start and end date for every single goal, so it's pretty much locked in. As we're developing this, also we're also sometimes think of, I guess some strategies I've seen for goal writing include, make sure you have your measurement piece in there. So I'm going to measure as measured by observation and all those kind of things. Also keep in mind that if you feel like that's a necessary component in your district, there's no harm done in there. But we also have a space in our IEP system that says instrument or tools for measuring progress. That's where that information goes. So you get to spell out, here's how I plan to progress monitor this information. So we have space for those things that are separate than the goal statement. So the goal statement, when it's boiled down to its necessary components, has basically 3 parts. I'm going to talk about an optional thing here shortly also, but these are basic 3 components. We have a skill that we're trying to target. We're looking at this stimulus, material, or condition, sometimes called the given. And then we're looking at our criterion for acceptable performance or evidence of mastery of that skill, or we set the target for mastery in that case. And those things together make it into a measurable goal. Bottom line, though, when we're writing a goal, as we're looking at this, as we set up the environment for the student and for those observations, when we're done with our observations, we should be able to say yes or no. Can a student perform this? And that's measurability. If we can't see by looking or by hearing and watching and listening, then it's not a measurable goal. So can we see it or hear it? Yes or no? So I talk about these things, and the importance here for us as teachers is to keep in mind that we're required to write measurable goals and required to measure them. So one thing I always bring up at this juncture here is to think about when you accept IEPs from other locations, whether through move-ins or as the students moving within your own district, review the goals carefully. Make sure that you talk about or think about, how am I going to measure this? And how is this going to happen? What's this going to look like? What's my plan, the progress monitor of this particular goal? If it's not possible, then you need to have some real conversations around, how do I revise this IEP to correct this? How do I make this work for where I am right now, so I can still let's respect the students' needs and keep going with this particular goal if it's valuable to them. Or you might have to completely rewrite it if it's not something that's makes sense to you as you review it. But keep that in mind. That move-in process is mainly built for protection for students, so that the IEP and services and everything are built in similar fashion to what they already had. But it's also protection for you as a teacher, so you can review the IEP if the goals, services are not possible, or in your opinion, not viable or useful for the student. Then you get an opportunity to review and rewrite those pieces. Because I will tell you that as soon as if you revise or if you're doing your move-in conference and accept it as is, then that IEP is your IEP. It's no longer someone else's, it's yours. So everything written on there is your responsibility to implement as it's written. So you have to be careful about that. So little things to check there with goals especially are, look at the frequency of collection. How often do they plan for you to collect this data for this student? And if it's not realistic, have a conversation around what is realistic then. How are we going to meet the student's needs and still keep track of this progress? So, that's just thinking about goals that you've received. So I also ask folks to apply the same, I guess, commitment or considerations as you're developing your own goals. So before we get into anything else, think about what the student needs, and think about your needs as well. How am I going to progress monitor this goal? What tools do I have available? That's why we've had those conversations. So you start thinking about those things before you even start writing the goal. If you don't have a plan for progress monitoring, it's not going to magically happen later on. It's not going to be any easier to develop a plan on the fly than to figure it out right now. So you can have a plan for who's going to collect this information for me, or if I'm not going to do it, where can I find this, or who has this information that I need, and how can I get it? Who do I need to talk to get access to this, or for them to share it with me? So you need to have those conversations as you're developing the IEP, so you don't have those panic situations later on when you can't figure out how do I do this? How do I get this? Or this is so overwhelming. How do I do this every day? So we think about those pieces. So how frequently do you need to do this? Probably not every day, but how often do I need this data so I can collect and keep track of it, so we can see the student's progress over time? So I guess the simplified version of that is develop your goals with the end in mind. Where am I trying to get the student? What do I need to do to get there? What information do I need to keep track of so I know we're on pace for that outcome? So let's look at details here as we're looking at each one of these pieces. We're going to kind of unpack each one of these a bit. So target skill is think about how will the student demonstrate learning. Given the specially designed instructions, so you don't need to write that in your goal, by the way, because that's a given. We are, especially if you're writing a goal, the student's receiving specially designed instruction, that or at least should be. But we need to think about how will the student demonstrate what he or she knows, understands, or can do by the end of the IEP. So some of those things like understanding something, what's the outward evidence of that understanding? What's the outward evidence of that knowledge that I can see happen, whether it's a permanent product like an assignment or an interview or whatever it is that I can see that's evidence of this. So I need to be able to see it or hear it. And that's the next slide kind of underlines that concept as we're looking at this. So a lot of folks find this little slide really helpful to help us be clear in our goals as we write them. So hopefully you can see that. So words that can prevent goals from becoming measurable. And I catch myself in this one all the time. I'll use the identify. Student will identify the main idea after reading a grade level passage, 4 out of 5 times or however, whatever we have to say about it. Issue there is, how do you propose they identify it? I know that sounds kind of picky to me sometimes when I start talking about this, but we're going to be very clear. So and sometimes think about by the end of the IEP, how do I expect the student to identify the main idea? I want them to say it. I want them to circle it. I want to underline it, write it out, whatever it is, so that it's clear that they understand what the main idea is. Or, so think about verbs that are more precise: write, to draw, to name, point, touch. All those things are, I guess, more action verbs. And I do want to share here, sometimes folks will put in like, after reading a 4th grade passage, the student will be able to write the main idea. Now, we can take the words "be able to" out of all of our goals, because we're not concerned about the ability to do it. I want to see that you can actually do it. So ability to do something is invisible. You might have the ability to read a foreign language, but I can't tell that by just looking in your eyes. You have to show me that. So how do I know you can do it? I can hear you do it. So those are the things that to really measure something, we have to see it or hear it. So the challenge here, and I'll move on to this next slide here. The challenge here sometimes is, as we set up for the goal, think about how do we make behavior something observable. We have to be able to see it or hear it to make sure it's measurable. Remember that. So sometimes I see goals written like, when the student is angry, he will implement a calming strategy after a prompt from the classroom teacher, which is a great start for a goal at least. The problem is, I don't know what anger looks. I know what anger looks like because I'm a reasonably emotionally stable person, I guess. I know when someone's angry, but we might need to say, what are the clues? What are the physical cues that I know the student's getting angry or getting frustrated or is upset or is anxious or whatever it is, so that I, as a classroom teacher, know I'm supposed to prompt them to start this calming strategy. If it's just say, when the student's angry, then that's up to my interpretation. They might not be angry, and they're going to be really mad. I might escalate them into anger if I tell them to use a calming strategy when they're not really angry. They're just tired or something else. So we have to think about that when we write goals around behavior, and be really clear on the behavior we're trying to affect here. And sometimes that means you need to look back at your functional behavior assessments, behavior intervention plans to see, how is this behavior defined? What is it that we're trying to affect here? And how we're going to define that. So the other things we see with behavior-oriented goals, the student is cooperative 80% with teacher instruction 80% of the time. I've seen goals written like that. So in that case, I ask folks to look at, what in your mind looks like compliance, or what does cooperation look like for the student? Or, sometimes I see participation goals, for example. So what does participation look like in your mind for this student? When the teacher asks for questions, I want them to raise their hand at least once per period to ask a question. I've also seen problems with that kind of goal, because if the student doesn't have any questions, then we're saying, well, you have to ask one anyway. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we have to think about how that's going to work. So these are just some examples of, what's not really measurable versus what's measurable, or at least in our minds here. So I've seen that, student will increase the ability to read to grade level text to 80% accuracy. Like, how do you do that? Demonstrate understanding of counting by, okay, we don't need, let's be specific on what we want the student to do that's going to demonstrate that. How do we know they've increased their ability to read? How do we know what's the outward evidence of their understanding of a math concept? How are we going to know those things? So we look for those physical examples of that. And again, they can be just telling me these things too. Doesn't have to be something written down all the time. So stimulus material or conditions, I a lot of times turn this as the given. Where and under what conditions is the student expected to perform the behavior or skill? So think about that for a second. Think about goals that you have just written, and consider, if you read the goals without your I guess foreknowledge, does it really give you the framework that you need? Sometimes I see goals written like elementary school. The students having trouble with transitions from favorable to unfavored activities. So we write something like, when transitioning from favorable to unfavorable activities, the student will initiate the unfavorable activity with fewer than 2 prompts from the classroom teacher 80% of the time, which doesn't sound too bad until you think about all the transitions a student goes through during the day. Do you really want to track this and think then all day long for the student, for all the transitions from favorable to unfavorable activities? There might not be too many of those, but sometimes it's just all transitions. I've seen goals written around that. And how do you keep track of all that? How many transitions are we having throughout the school day? And what I ask folks to think about then in those cases is, where does the problem really lie? Is it from a play activity to a structured classroom activity, like recess to classroom work, lunch to classroom work, or is it like just preferred reading activity to ELA to math or science or something like that? So we can be more specific. So we're not trying to keep data on everything, but just focus on those pieces that we need. And then we can be more focused on, like, if we have behavior problems in one period of the day, we can focus on that first, and then hopefully generalize the skills we're teaching for the student to deal with that situation into other situations as well. So just to illuminate this a little bit more, the stimulus material or conditions, again, is a context or an environment where you expect the behavior to occur. So what I've been relating a lot lately is, think about it doesn't match up 100%, but think about this as a science experiment. So we want to check on, for a science experiment to be valid, we set the tone and the conditions the same each time. So if we want to check the conditions, we have to set up the thing the same way each time. So that's what we're doing here. For an observation or data collection to work, we have to set get the same information each and every time. So in a small group, the student will, in the designated classroom, with this material, with this device, whatever it happens to be. So every time I'm observing the student performing in this environment, I give them the same structure, so that it's the only thing that I'm looking for that's different is the student's learning. So materials can be part of this. Reading, what kind of reading sample, what kind of graphic organizer, a communication board, whatever it is, we're lining that out in the goal, so that here we're setting the parameters for experiment here. So so we can repeat this, because if we want to say the students met this goal, we need to be able to repeat this and show, hey, they can do it. Look, I can do it again. Look at this, they did it again. Look at this, they did it again. And have that evidence, be able to, and another person needs to be able to do this as well. So we need to be clear enough here that if I've never met the student and I'm reading your IEP for the first time, I can set this up, so set this experiment up so that I can replicate your results. I want to see, yeah, you'd said in your last IEP that they could do this. I want to set this up so I can see it happen, and see if I need to do anything else with this. So here's some examples of the stimulus material or conditions, and you can see some of these I've already mentioned. You know, given a third grade reading passage, given 10 second grade level word problems, and so on. And you can see those things. So, you know, tell us what the student's environment looks like, or if there's something they've just done after this event has happened, the student will, whatever, like after reading independently at a text at a first grade level, here's what I want the student to do. And that's at the end of the IEP. So this is also, if you think in terms of resetting this experiment over and over, it also sets us up for that formative assessment that I mentioned already. So we're thinking about, I need to regularly do this, regularly assess this student, so I can see how their behaviors change over time, see how their skills develop over time, see how their mobility's changed, or their speech is improved, or they've better navigated their environment. Whatever it happens to be, I need to set this up so I can establish this over and over throughout the school year and see how the progress changes, given the instruction that I'm providing for this student. So the last piece of this is the criteria for acceptable performance. So when we think about this, the bottom line is how we know, given this the situation we're putting the student in, we want them to be able to perform a certain skill for us. What level of accuracy are we expecting then? Or what quantity of work, or what's fluency, and all those kind of things. How are we going to know when this goal is achieved? So things to keep in mind. I've mentioned some of these words already in this, or concepts at least in this today. Think about an ambitious and attainable target. So those are two really big concepts there. I'll try to expand on them a little bit here. So the first is ambitious, and this comes from I guess a federal case that we had, actually a Supreme Court case, that looked at the level of educational outcome we should expect from students. More or less, where we had been left previously was states could decide, and some states decided that the IEP just had to show minimal, or if any, outcomes for students. Others went a lot further than that, obviously. When it came to federal court, what they ended up, the Supreme Court, is they finally came up to the decision that they need to have measurable educational outcomes. So we're looking for ambitious targets for our students, and to borrow a phrase from that result, that ambitious is still not really a measurable term for us, as we just talked about measurability. So that was always hard for me, but at least in my view, and ambitious is, you know, thinking about the work we're going to put in and the work the student's going to put in. What's the best we can expect from that, you know, and thinking about, you know, if we look at the growth the students made in years past, is that acceptable to us, the growth they've made? If it's not, then what more can we do? You know, what else can we add to the students' plan so that we get better, possibly better results? So being ambitious, but also thinking about attainable there. We're not going to set these so high that they're impossible, but with all of our support and the students' involvement, how far do we think we can get? And that can be that's a pretty high target to set for us. And the idea, of course, is even if we don't get there, we still made a lot of progress toward that outcome for that student. So we want to make sure our goals and our progress monitoring is set up to reflect that. Because sometimes I think we don't do a clear enough job on our progress monitoring, or frequent enough collection, I should say, to show what growth has been made. If we set the goal too vaguely, then the progress may not show much. So we want to make sure we have good evidence, not just of the students' progress of that, but also of all the work we've put in. To look at all this progress we've made, even if we don't get to this goal, I should be able to say, but look how far we've come. Look at the growth we've gotten. We didn't get to this target, which is, there's lots of factors that can come to play in there. Attendance can be one, illness, all kinds of things. Worldwide pandemic can be one thing, but we can look at, here's the growth we have made, though. We need to be able to point to that, show here's evidence of the students' work, and that's also evidence of ours. So keep that in mind. That's good evidence. That's a way for us to show all the work that's been put in place for the student. So when we're thinking about criteria for acceptable performance, think in terms of, accuracy, how accurate we want the student to be. Like, given so many types of math problems, the student will answer them correctly, or will correctly compute them, or compute them correctly, however you want to write that. Correctly compute 80% of the 20 problems, or whatever it is happens to be. So accuracy is through quantity, how many times do they do something, how often and frequency. Duration is like the length of the behavior, and then latency is the time it takes from maybe you've given a student an instruction or a prompt for them to actually do that task, or initiate that task. So that latency can be one of those ways to talk about things without talking about work completion, which is something that transition review folks will push back on pretty hard. What do we want the student to do when they're given an instruction or a task from a classroom teacher? The student will initiate that task with fewer than 2 prompts 80% of the time, 2 verbal prompts, or I don't know, you can think of it in different ways, but if the problem the student's having is initiating the task, then we can talk about that latency piece. Like, after instruction, student will initiate. With duration, we can say once a student has initiated the task, they will work steadily for at least this long in 4 out of 5 observations over the course of 9 weeks, or something like that. And then frequency, that usually is an observation piece where we're counting how often something happens, like out of seat behavior, on task behavior, how often. Some on task usually is duration, though. It depends on how you look at it, I guess. Now, fluency and rate is speed. How fast will they do something? And sometimes that comes into mobility. Sometimes it comes into reading fluency, math fluency. Those can be different measures. Different folks like that better than others, but those are some ideas there. And there are I'm sure there are lots of other ways to do this. So this is by no means the only method or options you have, but some things to think about. How am I going to measure this? How am I going to know when they're done? They can do it this many times accurately, or they can do it to this level of accuracy. They can do it this many times. They can do it for this long, or after this quickly. So those are some ways you can think about options to measure pieces. So this is an optional piece, so that I wanted to talk about here briefly and see if it makes sense to folks. And if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. When we're thinking about criteria for acceptable performance, this is something we think about in terms of maintenance. And the way that I try to explain this one is, we might write a goal that the student can do something. They can, let's say, given 10 single-digit math problems, the student will calculate 8 out of 10 accurately. So that might be enough. And that goal will be fine by itself. But I also might think, well, what happens if, I want to make sure there's a check in there for multiple attempts or multiple observations. So I guess the example I use is, for a student, if I know that the first time they do that for me, I'm like, wow, they completed that goal. Is that enough? Am I ready to move on to something new for that student? Or do I need to test this again a couple more times just to make sure they really have gotten it? So that's what this maintenance is really about. So after the student in my example has completed 10 math problems to that level of accuracy that I expected, is that enough? And you as a teacher kind of get to decide, as a teacher of record, you get to decide as I write the goal, is that gonna be true of this student when they get it, we're ready to move on? Or after they get it the first time, should I check a couple more times or more just to see if they've maintained that information before we're ready to move on to something new? So this is kind of an optional thing, and I'll give you an example here with counting. So the goal is around the student orally counting with no errors in a weekly trial. So I can technically stop this goal right after the word trials. But with adding that little maintenance component in there, I said for 3 consecutive weeks. So she's doing weekly assessments already. When she gets to being able to count to 100 orally with no errors, then if I stop that right here after trials, then the goal will be complete and I can move on. But if I add the maintenance pieces for 3 consecutive weeks, I would say, okay, you got it this week. Let's see if you can do it next and the following. If I can get all 3 of those at that acceptable level, then we are ready to move on. So we're still tracking the let's see, orally counting to 100. So we're still tracking that each time for those 3 weeks. We're seeing if we got the 100% for those 3 times in a row. Once we do, then we're ready to move on to the next goal. So hopefully that's the piece. So that's to go back here, the components, 3 components of a measurable goal. So questions, concerns about those 3 pieces, any details, and we're going to go through an example here together as well, so we can see this kind of in action. Any questions? Oh, there's a So, Brittany, those are good questions there. So first part is, what kind of reading comprehension goal would you write for a student who is in 5th grade, but is at a 1st grade reading level? Is it okay to say student will be able to write down the characters in the story at his or her current reading level? So yeah, you could do some different things like so it depends on how the problem is going to be access for that student right there. Because obviously if it's a 5th grade reading assignment, if they give them a 5th grade paragraph to read at that reading level, then they're going to struggle, or it might take them a long time to get through that content. And you have to, and if writing is going to be a struggle for that student, which often go hand in hand, then yeah, how do we do this? Are we going to, and what do I want them to get out of this reading passage? What do I want them to understand out of this piece so that we have evidence of that understanding going on? And sometimes we have those texts also that are available while it's a 5th grade text. Now, usually this comes into play with like science, social studies, where it's the same content but a lower reading level. That's not always possible for those, but I think it'd be okay. Student will write down. You can just say, your student will write characters in the story, and you don't have to say at her current reading level. You just say write the characters in the main character of the story, or describe the main character of the story in writing. And so if they listen, so that's kind of the things that we have to talk about in terms of the second piece that you have there is they can't read at their grade level, but if they listen to it being read, they can answer the comprehension questions. So some of those pieces will be a challenge there because, are we testing reading comprehension? So in those cases, a lot of times we have to give them a lot of extra time to get through that content, which is tough. And comprehension can be hard there. But if we're looking at whether the student master the concept and understand what's going on in the story, then listening to it might be just fine. So you have to have that discussion as you start setting up these kind of goals with the team that is at your case conference, really, because I can't sit here and tell you this is the only way to do this, but think about, given when the story is read aloud to the student, he will answer, write correct answers to uh, comprehension questions based on that story. That could be a good goal for those things, but you need to have those conversations around, what's that going to look like for the student? And really, we do have the options in our state assessments now for read aloud for all. So if the student has a print disability or something like that, then you can have those conversations and make that an accommodation in those such situations also. So yeah, that's a big conversation to open up in those pieces. And right. And Denise, I like your point too. When you're writing a goal, it says, given instructional level text, the student will read it with the 80% accuracy on 4 to 5 opportunities. Well, I have 2 questions on, like I think what you pointed out is by the end of the IEP, what's their instructional level? What do you think it's going to be? So you're thinking ahead to a year from now, what we'd like to get to and what level of accuracy we'd like to be in that. So how are we measuring accuracy in reading on that particular piece? That's right. Yeah, we're looking at, we want to move the student. Exactly. So if we don't change that, right now the student I know can read at 3rd grade level at this level of accuracy. By the end of this IEP, I'd like him to read at, let's say, the middle of 4th grade level year reading at a level of accuracy or level, or and so accurate reading, is that correct words per minute? That's the other piece I'd like to understand too, is what is it correct accurate reading is. Reading fluency usually is what they're talking about. So that might be where you look at your goal there, adjusting it. Or else how do we measure accurate reading? We can also look at, I guess, there's different ways I guess you could look at it rather than just the fluency rate. But that would be my question too, is I wouldn't have a clear understanding. I could probably figure it out, but of what exactly how they're getting to 80% accuracy, so that would be. And I think the other points that we talk about with those pieces is, you could also with the given specify in which setting do you want them to think. Is it reading in English language arts only, or because that's typically where you're going to measure the accuracy of reading. When you get into other curricular areas, the students may read, but then they're really only going to be measuring their comprehension of what's read. So I don't know. I don't want to beat this one to death, but that's the kind of. I appreciate your questions as we look at those, because those are all can get really complicated. But the bottom line is thinking about, what does the student need? What are we going to do about it, and how are we going to show the students made progress toward that outcome? So and that's really what the components we're looking for. As a bottom line for goals, again, is writing what do we want the student to understand, know, or be able to do by the end of the IEP. Given all the work we're going to do, where do we expect them to land a year from now, which is really hard. And that's one reason I use those kind of science analogies, because I want to come back to the idea of that and really think about that this is a hypothesis. The whole IEP really is, but goals are too. Based on the data we have at the time, where do we think the student can land after a whole year of us working with them intently? I should say intensely, when we look at that. So that's the big idea with this, and all the work we're going to put in place. Man, where can we go with this student? And it could be a lot further than we have seen in the past if we look at it that way. So let me jump to a little example I wanted to do together here. So this time around, what I tried to do with this goal piece is kind of illustrate and use the consensus building process we used with our different groups at the a resource center network at the state level. So one of the things we did, somebody came up with this format, and they looked at a goal and kind of really just picked it apart, because essentially what we wanted to be able to do is decide if it's measurable or not. Is it skill-based, yes or no? And then if it's neither of those things, how do we make it better? So that's kind of the tools that I want to give you guys today, and what we're going to end up talking about here to end our time is looking at this goal we have here. And I'm going to go to a bigger view of this. And I'll read it for you here. It says, during unstructured conversation, student will correctly use regular and irregular past tense verbs with at least 80% accuracy each, with no more than 2 cues across 3 consecutive sessions. So as we're reading this, a lot going on, and maybe a lot of problems too. So when we started breaking this down, we had questions around, what's unstructured conversation even mean? And knowing what that terminology knowing terminology can be a problem. We had a lot of conversations around the word each in there. So are you saying we're going to measure each of these individually, or what's going on? And it's going to be hard to track if we have to keep track of those two things. And one of the clues I always look for is and. If you see and in a goal, typically that's a list of things that we're trying to keep track of. And when you find yourself doing that, look at the last thing in that list. Typically, we list things in order of magnitude. I don't think there's research that I know of behind that, but that's what I see a lot. So think of that last thing there. That's your end target. Students going to have to learn item 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order to be able to do this last thing. So why don't we just focus there, knowing that I have to teach to build that way. I have to teach these other things in order for the student to attain this last piece. Cues aren't clear, so when we use cues in there, specify if it's verbal, visual, that kind of thing, and we'll see. So that's what we look for here, is that the given that was mentioned. We look at the skill, and then how we're going to know what the measurement's going to take place. What's it going to look like? So the team agreed this is not a measurable goal. Ultimately, it contains multiple skills, and it's not clear what I'm supposed to do to measure as far as cues there. And we decided the goal was skill-based. However, it's based on, there's 2 skills listed there, using regular and using irregular past tense verbs. So the way we talked about this as a means to fix it, I already had, when I used this example, as we had more conversations, there's more construction I'd add to it. Really, during unstructured conversation, that can happen at any time during the school day. So technically, to make this measurable, truly measurable, I'd have to put a framework on when I'm going to observe this. Is it during a particular class period, during a recess, during lunch, between classes, before school, after school? So I want to spell that out here, so I don't have to follow this student around all day long to track all their unstructured conversations. I actually was a fan, and in the conversation with the group that I had, I was a fan of just removing this parenthetical phrase here. So instead of it having these parentheses, it just read, will correctly use past tense verbs. And I don't think you need to say at least 80% accuracy, but that's fine. And then with no more than 2 verbal cues across 3 consecutive sessions. So that the 2 pieces that I put into this goal to make it better than it even shows here is add a structure for when you expect to see this happen. And then I don't think there's anything other than regular or irregular past tense verbs. So let's just say that alone. And then I think it's, we're in pretty good shape. So let's kind of try to do this as the ending kind of activity today. And I'm going to put something in the chat here so we can, in case I forget. Real quick. So take a little time and read through that piece. I just put in the chat a link to the evaluation today. So I put that in earlier, but if you need to head out, I know we're getting right up against our time frame. So if you do need to uh, take off, then please make sure you follow that link to evaluate. And if you're registered for today, you should get an email with the certificate for your professional growth points. If you're in a group viewing this together, make sure you email myself, and I'll put my email there again. Just like that. And I will make sure and make sure you include your email with that, and I'll make sure you get those pieces. So what I wanted to look at here on this particular goal was just looking at this particular and seeing if we can pick out the pieces as we're looking at it. During a 50-minute class period, student will ask for help, clarification, or use resources when stuck in order to have a sense of urgency in completing work, an average of 12 out of 12 trials in 9 weeks. So when you look at that particular goal, what jumps out at you? You know, what problems do you see right away? You know, do you see that given piece? Is that in there? Do you see the target skill? Do you see the criterion for mastery? And are they good quality as you're looking for them? So let's see if we can get some feedback on this one. When you look at this, is this goal measurable? Yes or no? So when we look at this goal, in order for it to be measurable, we need to be focusing on this individual skill. So you see the or in here kind of gives us a problem. You know, we'll ask for help, clarification, or use resources. So there's a bunch of things going on here. And during a 50-minute class period, kind of limits us a little bit. Because which class periods? Is this all class periods, all during the school day? And if a class period is shorter or longer, does that count? That's kind of weird to say that, but that's something to consider. And sense of urgency doesn't make a whole lot of sense in there. And then completing work an average of 12 out of 12 trials. And I don't know how you average 12 out of 12 unless you're expecting them to be perfect every single time. So that's hard to do. So suggestions to fix this particular goal, focus on a class period possibly, or a couple class periods. What do you expect the student to do? More or less, this goes back to the kind of goal that we were talking about earlier on. When the student's given an opportunity, or when they're given instruction to begin an assignment, the student will initiate that task, is what we really want to have happen here. Or do we want them, if the student is given an assignment and doesn't initiate the task, what do we want them to do? Ask for help? So we can go that way too. Or raise their hand, ask for help, ask a question pertaining to the task, whatever it is, so we can focus on, hey, we just want you to start working. Or after restatement of directions, the student will initiate the task, whatever it happens to be. So you're sure the student's got the instruction and they're ready to initiate the task based on what you've shown them so far. So I know that's a lot of quick information and a little bit over time today. So I do want to say I appreciate you guys spending some time with me this morning. And hopefully we got through some basics on developing goals and showed you a couple examples in there as we had a chance to chat. If you have any questions or you have goals you'd like us to look over together, feel free to reach out. Here's the evaluation link again, and our website, and that's my contact information. So if you want to reach out, if you have further questions. Goal of peer check. Oh yeah. This one here. So that's also in your Padlet. I should mention that. So that's in your document in a blank form. So you can find it there as well. So the reason we're going to be sharing this same process, this review process at iCase this week, to just talk about